Well, it's wonderful to be here with you today, Scott. You are, of course, a prolific, eminent author, advisor, teacher, written countless books, I think 8 as of the time of recording, 9 to come, many articles on HBR, being very successful in the business world as an advisor and an owner of a business, which you've sold Insight relatively recently. And of course, you're now a professor too. Is there anything else you haven't done? You have a big family. You've moved back from Singapore. We'll talk about that. But of course, you're known around the innovation agenda, disruptive change, and everything that goes with that. And I want to talk today about what it takes to initiate, stimulate, if you like, scale, and most importantly, sustain disruptive change in organizations. What it involves in the mindsets, the skills, the practices, and the magic that goes around it, dispelling various myths. So welcome to the show.
David, it is my pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. The D word, not your middle name, but the D word, this disruptive word, is something that's become part of the vocabulary in most, if not all, organizations, and has been pioneering. Obviously, you've been right at the beginning of that process, working with Clay and others and practicing it. But it's also been misused and misunderstood. Just to frame the conversation, when you talk about disruption to CEOs and disruptive change, what do you mean by it?
It is a great entering point question. And you mentioned Clay Christensen, of course, the father of disruptive innovation, who I had the opportunity to learn from in many guises. He was at different points, my professor, my boss, my co-author, my colleague, and most importantly, my friend. And he would say one of the great regrets in his life was picking that word disruption to describe the phenomena that he observed in his doctoral research, because it is such a loaded term. It's got meaning in the dictionary, and people essentially use it as a synonym for any kind of big change. And Clay, of course, identified something really specific. So the simple definition that I use, and there's nuances and subtleties we can go and explore, is that disruptive innovation is one that transforms what exists and creates what doesn't, by making the complicated simple and the expensive affordable. And there's a couple important things in that. First, if you listen to it carefully, there is a note of comparison, of relativity in it. So you're looking at something compared to something else. That's an important thing. And second, there's a notion of trade-offs in it. The key to a disruptive innovation is it sacrifices performance along a dimension that historically mattered in a market in return for something else. And the disruptive trade-off, as mentioned, is typically take something complicated, make it simple, take something expensive, make it affordable. There's, of course, a lot of branches you can explore underneath it, but that's the basic way that I think about it.
What a brilliant opening. Now, you worked with many CEOs and C-suite leaders and founders. I bet they would get that conceptually, especially if you articulated it. But then it comes to the crunch where you have to sacrifice, you have to make those trade-offs, and their insecurities may come into mind, the pressure from investors, and so forth and so forth. How do you get over that inertia and fear to actually practice what is a compelling and intuitive principle?
Well, we can spend many hours talking about just this, but I think one of the most important things, anytime you're trying to deal with something that's got some kind of adaptive nature to it, which disruptive change is a component of what's more broadly known as adaptive change, where there's lots of uncertainties. The only way you can really know is by doing and learning, where you are going to have to deal with uncertainty, where there's a possibility that there are going to be winners and losers, and the certainty that you're going to struggle as you deal with the learning that comes along with any kind of change. Anytime you deal with something like that, to me, the most important thing is recognize you cannot prove that you're going to be successful analytically. So don't try to do that. You have to learn experimentally. That is the only way that you can do it. So if people are waiting for there to be a perfectly formed disruptive strategy for them to go and implement that's going to work nice and seamlessly in their organization, it's never going to work. If people say, I know I need to do this, I know it's going to be hard, so I'm going to experiment and learn my way to success, then they at least have a chance of succeeding. So that to me is first principle. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have to be willing to experiment. You have to be willing to learn, all in the name of doing really good things in the end. So of course the struggle is worth something, but you got to go through the struggle to get there.
That experimentation word, again, I think people will get and think, right, okay, I want to try. I don't want to start too big. I'm concerned about the sacrifice or the risks. But how do you set up an experiment to succeed? And succeed not necessarily to be successful, but to be a learning moment. How do you actually set up an experiment? Because again, I work with people and they go, I get experimentation, but I'm not quite sure how to do it.
The good news here is there's a lot of resources that you can draw. And of course, you can go back to the work that Sir Francis Bacon did a few hundred years ago as he and other thought leaders laid the foundational principles of the scientific method back in the 1600s. So you have that as a great starting point. And even more helpful, you have a bunch of people who have translated that to the business world over the course of the past few decades. In the startup world, you've got Steve Blank and Eric Ries. If you look at the academic world, Stephan Tomke has done some really good writing
Yes.
about the
Yes.
good discipline of experimentation in the business context. I tried to integrate this as best I can in my 2014 book, The First Mile. And the basic idea is to be like a scientist. And what does a good scientist do when they face uncertainty? They say, well, I don't know for sure. So I'm going to go and form a hypothesis, what I expect will happen. I'm going to design an experiment. The experiment's going to have very clear objectives, what I hope to learn from it. I'm going
Yes.
to, even if I have no idea what's going to happen, I'm going to make a prediction because making a prediction will force me to learn. And then I'm going to execute in a way in which I can measure that prediction and then do something with what I have gone and measured. If you
Mm.
listen very carefully, you heard an acronym in that. You never know for sure when you experiment. So make sure you always have hope, hypothesis, objective, prediction, and execution plan. And you do that
Mm.
with rigor and discipline, and it makes experimentation a lot easier. Now, there's a really important thing here. You said it in the question that you asked. It's important to recognize that you are experimenting not to confirm necessarily, you're experimenting to learn. You can set something
Mm.
up so it's a failure if you don't get what you expect, but in your mind, you should be saying, hey, anything that I learn is positive. If I learn this doesn't work, that's a good thing. If I learn there's a different approach, that's a good thing, but you have to be open to all of those possibilities.
Yeah. Gosh, that's compelling. Now, spin forward. You've done lots of experiments. You're seeing some new growth. I'm playing to the more dual transformation, I guess, framing, and you're having a fresh look at the core business, reinventing the core. The tipping points, or the tipping point where you think, right, okay, now we need to really scale further and shut down. If I was to massively simplify, no doubt you'll critique that. Again, talk me through the mindset and the moments when you get to that point where you think, actually, we now need to accelerate or dispose.
Yeah, so this gets back to, again, the discipline of experimentation. So you should, in the beginning, when you're working on anything, say, what are the barriers or the lines that I will cross that suggest I've made it? And a lot of this is around really understanding the idea that you're working on and saying, what are the key must be truths, critical assumptions, key uncertainties, whatever you want to call it? And when do I reach the point where I've received a preponderance of evidence that suggests this isn't going to kill me? I can overcome this thing. I've got what the people in the startup community would call product market fit, what you now see people saying profit market fit. I know I've got a business model that works, but that's really the signs that suggest you've got it. So you have whatever is specific to your idea, and then you've got the click in the market. The product fits with the customer. You've got the click with the business model. You've got a way to sustainably make money. You get those components together, and it's time to go and step on the accelerator. If you don't, if you're continuing to search and you can't figure it out, well, if you've got nothing else you're thinking about, then you might keep experimenting and iterating because you never know. But often it's a time to suggest that you've got a better idea that you ought to be focusing your time and attention on. And this is an important point. One of the things that I tell executives, it's important that you never consider an idea in a vacuum. Is if you look at a single idea, you will always convince yourself, but we haven't tried this. And what about this? And maybe we can do this. And yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe you could do those things. But the question is at the margins, the opportunity cost of doing that thing means there's something else that you're not doing. So you always need to be thinking, if not this, then what? And that will often help you understand the cycles that I'm killing here are stopping me from doing other things as well. So a lot in that, but if I play back the two key points there, you really want to make sure you've addressed the critical assumptions, most critically about you connecting to a market need and being able to make money, and recognize as you're making decisions, never consider ideas in isolation, or else you will spin forever on an idea that really should be put down.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of your recent pieces was talking about strategy and innovation in a context where you don't have a lot of data or information. And I thought that was very very interesting, and very lots of different ideas around that. But in that process you described, there will be points that even in the most data-rich organizations, you just simply won't know for sure. In many cases, you won't. Tell us a little bit more about decision making in that context where you have to rely on other things that inform your judgment, which is obviously an important leadership trait.
Now, a critical leadership trait, particularly in today's world. I was at a conference a couple years ago, and the CEO of Unilever got up on stage, and someone said, what is it like leading through these unprecedented times? This is a couple years ago. So the unprecedented things at that moment were we were still in the midst of a pandemic. There were big pressures on supply chains, and a conflict had just broken out in Ukraine. So those were the things that he was dealing with then. And he said, I'm kind of tired of living in unprecedented times. Can't we just live in precedented times for a while? 3 months later, he was relieved of duty as the CEO of Unilever, because this is the world today. It's just never ending. And in that never ending world of change, you have to make decisions without perfect information. That's kind of always been true, but it's really acute these days. And this creates a paradox. The paradox is what we call the information action paradox. By the time the data are clear about what you need to do, it's too late to do what the data is telling you to do. So you always are going to have to make decisions when you're dealing with any kind of thing with uncertainty, with imperfect information. So what do you do in the face of that? Well, a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot about doing good experimentation. The other thing that I generally suggest people do is get really good at trying to spot weak signals of change. And one way to spot weak signals of change is to do what I call deliberately wandering, which means that you are intentional in your search, but you're unintentional in where you're looking. You're trying to have your eyes as open as possible to try and see something that's just a glimmer of something, where you've got a pattern in your head and you can say, well, this really means something. The way that I do it is I spend time with my kids, which is nice. It gives me a 2-for-1 benefit, because kids are great ways to get glimpses of what the future will look like, because kids are very happy to try and experiment with new things, whether it's my oldest son playing around with crypto and social media, or my daughter doing things with digital content creation, my 12-year-old playing around with the metaverse, or my 7-year-old, well, just being cute. He's not yet at somewhere where I'm learning new technologies from him. But that kind of approach where you say, that's interesting. I'm seeing something. How does this fit with what I've seen before? Does this suggest that this technology is going faster? Does it suggest new opportunities are opening up? It's just something that gives you the deeper judgment so that you can make those wise decisions when you're confronted with uncertainty.
As you do that, it's the lens that you look through, isn't it? In a sense, whether it's an opportunity lens or a curiosity lens, as opposed to your example with the former CEO of Unilever. It comes across as more of we're trying to protect ourselves. We'll be batten down the hatches, protect ourselves, and once everything calms down, we'll carry on doing business, which is naive, if not stupid. But let me shift the conversation on now to some relatively recent developments, because I'm curious how they inform, infuse, challenge what you've just been talking about. And two I want to call out. One is around, I guess, the proliferation of self-management. And the second one is around artificial intelligence, and not just Gen AI, but artificial intelligence more broadly. So many organizations now are creating structures that give their people more entrepreneurial freedom, empowerment, and importantly, responsibility. Hire is the example that everyone quotes, but there are many, many others across the world. What does that do to the process of disruptive change, in particular, and how you, if you like, restructure and reinvent an organization when you have more distributed responsibility?
Well, I think it is a real positive for organizations trying to drive disruptive change, because what you're essentially trying to do is get a lot of gunk out of the organization that stops people from trying new things, from being distant from customers, from being distant from markets, and so on. So the ability to devolve and really empower experimentation and empower close to market learning is a great accelerant of generating ideas and developing disruptive concepts. Now, the challenge, if you are doing a lot of devolution, then you might run into a resource allocation problem. So, if you go and strip apart all of Clay's research into the dilemmas of disruption, there is a villain in the story, and the villain in the story is the resource allocation process within organizations, which, all else being equal, at the margins will allocate $1, euro, pound, whatever, to doing today better versus doing tomorrow differently. So you have to go and grab hold of that resource allocation process and make sure that you've got a good balanced portfolio and all that. In the case of an organization where you've done a lot of decentralization, sometimes if you're going to do something that's really big, you got to put big dollars, big euros, big pounds, big rupees, big
Yes.
whatever behind it. So
Yeah.
making sure that you also have a mechanism in the organization to say, hey, this part of the organization has figured out something that it doesn't realize how big and important it is. So we're going to let it keep doing what it's doing, and we're going to think about how we can really do this at enterprise scale. So, kind of the
Yes.
analogy that I have in my head, it's kind of the way Silicon Valley or any good venture capital ecosystem works, where the work is really devolved down to the entrepreneurs and the startup communities. But you've got people who've got lots of money that go and say, okay, this looks like one that's got real potential. Let's give it more. Oh, it's got even more. Let's give it more, and so on. And that sorting mechanism makes sure the really good ideas eventually get to global scale. So you need to think about how this can work inside a decentralized organization. Of course, Gary Hamel has done all the cutting edge research in this field. He talked about bringing Silicon Valley inside organizations 25 years ago. So I think his dream is finally coming true with Hire and some of the other decentralized organizations.
What you call out there in particular is, I guess, a more important role for the centre in terms of being a portfolio manager amongst other attributes, as opposed to being a sort of a holder of the bureaucracy, which obviously the gunk, I'll use that term, the gunk that Scott Anthony refers to. The other development obviously is AI not only doing process efficiency optimization and so forth, but actually being what I would call more of a teammate, a complement in the process of value creation. Again, I guess I've given you a leading question there. That's not very good, is it? But a leading question of how much potential do you see for AI in all of its forms in encouraging, stimulating disruptive change?
It's really interesting. So I'm just coming off earlier this year teaching a class up at Tuck called AI and Consultative Decision Making. About half the
That's
class
why
at
I
Tuck,
asked you.
yeah, so about half the class at Tuck ends up going into consulting. So we thought that would be a good way to frame it. Essentially say, well, you're a consultant. You're advising a client on a great big problem, and you got a new tool. How do you use that tool to overcome the biases and blind spots that make us as humans not very good at making decisions in certain contexts? And the step back reflection from that course is it's going to change a lot. I mean, that's not a big headline. I think everybody understands that. But when you actively play around with the technology, you begin to see more about how exactly that's going to play out. As I think about disruptive innovation, there are a few things that I see. Number one, that idea of having somebody else in the room. You talk about designing experiments. You can actually run a complete experiment that doesn't involve doing anything other than your computer as you go and simulate things with Gen AI. You talk about going and imagining how things work for customers. Well, you have AI take on different personas. It can be an incredibly efficient way to do market research. You want to generate creative ideas. If you just use basic prompts on AI, you're going to cut off the tails. You'll get more ideas quickly, but you're not going to get really great ideas. If you're thoughtful about how you use prompt engineering, chain of thought techniques were the ones that we found to be the most helpful. You can really get both ends where you get incredible speed and you increase the surface area to come up with really good ideas. You got great ways to pressure test inside organizations' ideas. You have lots of stakeholders that might say this, that, and the other. Again, you ask whatever is your large language model of choice to say, take on this persona, that persona. We had one team that was working on an idea in transportation. They said, well, what would Greta Thunberg say about this? There's really powerful ways to accelerate the process of learning. That is a huge thing. The other thing that I think is a really interesting thing just to contemplate, so far, and we'll see, it's an emergent technology, things can change. AI is playing out in a way where generally the people who are doing more with it are not the scrappy upstarts, but they're the large established organizations that have the money and have the unique data that can be used to train their own models to do interesting things. This will be a really interesting thing to watch. If we call this a Clayton Christensen style disruption writ large, you would expect a lot of startup companies to be driving things. And yes, of course, there are people who are doing the models and so on, but it's generally large established incumbents that are leading the way. Will that continue? Will there be more new companies that drive things? Will you get new business models that emerge? I'm sure we'll see some, but it's just an interesting thing to think about at this stage in its development. And of course, it's important to remember these things look like they happen overnight. They don't. The term artificial intelligence and the formal field of study was formed at Dartmouth College in 1956. So,
Indeed,
we're
indeed.
whatever that is, 68 years into the AI revolution.
Yeah, absolutely right. It is quite remarkable how people sort of talk about it being the last year or so, and they forget their history books. Not quite going back to Francis Bacon, but a few decades back. One of the things I admire about your work is the fact that you cover and integrate different concepts and practices. So I know you did some studies on organizational change, I think at INSEAD a few years ago. Yeah, I've done my homework or something equivalent to that. I'm not
That's
stalking you.
100% right. System psychodynamics, executive master and change at INSEAD. System
There you go.
psychodynamics is a great phrase to drop at cocktail parties if you want people to not talk to you anymore at cocktail parties.
Okay, it's a tongue twister. But one of my frustrations actually is not with your work, but generally is we tend to focus on single topics and issues because it's probably easy to digest. Oh, let's talk about strategy. Then let's talk about innovation. Then let's talk about culture, and the list goes on. And yet the reality of leading large organizations and any form of organizations is you have to find a way to integrate those practices, manage the trade-offs, actually manage the paradoxes. How do you, you do it, and I read your writing and listen to your work. How do, when you come across people who perhaps say, Scott, we need a growth mindset, for example, or we need this, a single issue thing, but actually it's only one part of the puzzle. How do you lead them through that, a journey that gives them a more integrated perspective and ultimately solution to a particular topic or situation?
Yeah, great question. I don't know that I have a silver bullet answer to it. It's a really hard area. If you look at the world that I now inhabit, living inside a business school environment, the entire system is set up for academics to go deeper in their field of study. So, people in strategy go deeper in strategy, and there are subfields of strategy that they go deeper in. And the peer review system and the way that people get tenure, it is all set up to encourage spiking deeper in known categories of inquiry,
Yes.
not to go to the places where we know the real breakthroughs happen, which is at the intersections of different categories. I mean, we know that. The structure of scientific revolution, Thomas Kuhn pointed that out, 52 years ago, that's where the paradigm shifts happen. But systems are not set up to do that. Inside organizations, we've got the finance function, and we've got the marketing function, and we've got the strategy function. And the real world is the integration of all of those things. How do you get people to begin to see it? Well, as best I can, what I try to get people to do is to shift their perspective, shift their frame. Is that if you look at issues from a different lens, sometimes you can see things that you would otherwise miss. A great simple example of this came from a Japanese organization that I'm doing some research around right now. The company is Shiseido. It is a cosmetics company that has undergone a pretty dramatic transformation in the past few years. CEO came in 2014, first CEO from outside the organization. The organization at that time was 142 years old. And he had a very ambitious change agenda that involved restructuring and driving a lot of change, going to new categories and so on. One important part of that is he changed the way that the organization thought about time. So he went back to the very origins, said we were founded in 1872. We were East meets West. Technology was at the core of what we did. This is who we are. So it goes back to the origins of the organization. Then goes and says, basically, I'm going to change everything, almost literally everything about what's happening in the day-to-day. We're going to speak a different language from Japanese to English. I'm going to change the structure. I'm going to change the way we make decisions and so on. But change nothing, because 1872, this is who we are. And by the way, my plan is not a 1-year plan or a 3-year plan. I've got that. But I'm also setting the foundation for the next 100 years. So went back 140 years, went forward 100 years, and focused at the present at the same time. Why does all of this matter? Well, I was talking to the CFO at the beginning of this transformation. I was asking him, you had to make some really big investments, your new R&D center, opening up new innovation facilities and so on. How hard was that? He said, well, it was really easy. Because if we're thinking about laying the foundation for the next 100 years, there's no debate about doing this. We know we have to do it. Do I have to make sure that the books balance at the end of the year? Of course.
Sure,
Do we have to deliver against our objectives? Of course. But there's no doubt that making this investment is a smart thing to do. So that idea of changing the time frame to change people's perspective, to get them to think in a more integrated way, is at least one way you can do it. But that, to me, is the key to begin to answer your question. Have people look at the problem in a different way, and sometimes they'll see things that they otherwise would miss.
What a great example and what a great perspective. God, that's so refreshing compared to what you hear and experience day to day, which is often very short-termist or forgetting the past and not looking too far in the future.
And,
I
there
guess
are
the
risks
other,
in all these things, because
oh,
sorry to cut you up, but you go too much in the past, you're going to be constrained. You got to change. And you go too much in the future, you don't earn the right to get there because you got to deliver the present. So the magic in this is being able to be in all three of those time horizons simultaneously. I've tried to find, by the way, just because I was curious, is there a Marvel character or whatever who can do this as a metaphor? And there isn't a good one. There's very fringe comic book characters that can span across time. Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen is the closest that I found. But anyway, that is a random comment.
that may be a task for your 7-year-old to
Yeah, there you
create
go. I
one.
like it.
There you go. One of the other changes that we've seen is obviously the proliferation of ecosystems, particularly platform ecosystems, which if you're in them as the way you do business, if you're not, it's sort of a technical nerdy term that people don't quite understand. However, many organizations are actually operating in them, but actually their strategy innovation process is still very much one that's grounded in a more vertically integrated closed system, i.e. that they do it on their own and then they tend to parcel it out to others. In your experience and as an advisor and teacher, what has more open collaborative systems, however they're formed and structured, what has that done to the process that we've been talking about?
Well, it has changed it for sure. So, I reflect back on a sign that Clay had in his office, a handcrafted sign that said anomalies wanted. And Clay's basic point is a good scientist likes it when they see things that they don't expect. When you see something where your theory says this will happen and that happens instead, because that is an opportunity to learn. And indeed, that is true. That's the way that science develops. Anomalies. In 2007, when the iPhone came out, Clay famously said, "It looks through my lens like a sustaining technology. I predict Apple will fail." Obviously, that was woefully wrong. And I think as you reflect on it and also reflect on Clay saying the same thing about Tesla, the lens that he didn't have was the ecosystem lens. So, Apple goes and creates a very powerful, different dynamic ecosystem where it's changing the dynamics between carriers and the phone providers. It creates the App Store. It is an ecosystem play. It's not just a product play. Tesla is the exact same thing. Go direct to consumer without going through third-party dealers, change the way that you update the cars from hardware to software. That's something that is a completely different ecosystem and mindset that the ones that the traditional auto manufacturers follow. Incredibly difficult to respond to for the same reasons where a traditional product-based disruption was hard for a company to respond to. So it's still, through my lens, has a lot of disruptive aspect to it, but it's different than what Clay identified. It is an anomaly. So as you start thinking about what does that mean today, well, Ron Adner, one of my colleagues at Talk, is the leading thinker on ecosystem strategy. Winning the Right Game and The Wide Lens are his two
Yes.
books. You have to devour his work, because in that work you see, how do I go and successfully compete within an ecosystem? And if that's what I'm going to go and do, I need to understand that. Or if I'm really trying to disrupt an existing one, how do I go create a new one? Is if I don't go and I go into an established ecosystem, lots of avenues to innovate and grow, but disruption is not going to be an option for you. You will be forced to conform to the rules of the ecosystem. You create an avenue for the incumbent to say, all right, that looks good. I'm Meta. I'm going to go and acquire you, Instagram. I'm going to go acquire you, WhatsApp, and I'm going to very nicely put you into my ecosystem. In another world, you would have those two driving big disruption. We talk about how Facebook followed an arc like this. In this world, Meta just merrily chugs along.
Brilliant. We're going to just shift now to shift the tempo and the focus. We're going to go for a little bit of a quick fire round and also focus a little bit more on you. And it's going to be fun. Don't worry. It's not going to be painful. I guess the first question I'm interested in is, for all the topics where you've discussed already and you've covered in your work, what are the areas you're most fascinated by because you think they are misunderstood? There are misconceptions. What's on your shopping list? It's a cheeky question to give.
Yeah, there's a lot, but I think if I pick one, I think people try to find scapegoats for any tough problem, and the scapegoat that people will often pick for the dilemmas of disruption is they will point to public stock markets and say, well, I wish I could, but the public stock markets put short-term pressure on me, and therefore I can't do this. Having lived overseas and worked with CEOs of organizations that are public, private, family-run, government control, et cetera, the challenges have nothing to do with the stock markets. The challenges have to do with the brains of the people running the organizations.
Great answer. Great answer. Now, you've made a number of transitions in your life from the US to Singapore to back. I think you had a brief sojourn into the UK as well. You've shifted from being a partner in a consulting firm to a teacher to an advisor. You made a number of transitions. What's the one thing that served you well as you've made those professional and personal and family life transitions?
I think to me, the gift that I got from, I don't know if it was my parents, my upbringing, or whatever, I'm a pretty insanely curious person. So transitions are exciting because they're new opportunities to learn and develop. As humbling as it can be, I went from being a consultant to being a teacher, and I was pretty good at being a consultant. And there are parts of being a teacher that I'm pretty good at, but there's a lot that I have to learn. So you're kind of back at the age of, I guess I made that transition when I was 47. You're kind of back at day one, which is humbling, but also really fun. So, if you view it as an opportunity to learn and develop, it just looks different. And that's the way I choose to view it.
Here's another cheeky question. You have a fast mind. You're a prolific output. I would love to talk to you about that. But how do you pace yourself, being blunt, when you're with people who are, and I'll say this, not you, but perhaps not quite as quick. They haven't got the expertise, they haven't got the curiosity, but they have the right intent, but frankly, you've got a faster mind. I'm putting words in your mouth. How do you manage yourself in those contexts where you want to move on, you want to keep driving things forward and stimulating, and you have to slow yourself down? How do you cope with it?
I'm smiling because it's like you read feedback that I got from colleagues at Insight, the consulting company I was part of for a couple of decades, repeatedly, which is sometimes you have to slow down to speed up, and that's a lesson that I'm still learning. I had a class session this term where I'm like, well, I've got 7 brilliant insights that I'm sure students are going to get all of them by the end of class. And about 2/3 of the class, we've gone through one of them. I'm like, okay, well, let me just rattle off the next. I'm like, no. Actually, this is great. The one thing they're going to leave with is going to be a great insight. So let's just go and just soak on that and really go and focus on it. I just did a training program over at Harvard Business School last week called Teaching with Cases, about how you use the case study method to go and teach. And it was a fantastic program. But one of the things that really struck me is one of the facilitators said, I don't have a teaching plan, I have a teaching forecast. And the teaching forecast is no more than one thing that I really hope students leave with. And if it turns out they leave with something else, that's good, not bad. It means that the class has gone in a different direction and something good has come from it. As long as I, the facilitator, has made sure that that voice has come out and people really leave with that learning. This is the number one thing that I'm working on, being able to slow down and get that rhythm and help make sure that learning cements. Cements is not the right word, but you get the point.
I get it, yeah. And your biggest superpower?
So I would go back to the curiosity and the desire to keep learning and just saying, that's strange. I don't expect that. And then the curiosity feeds into synthesis, which is a superpower with kryptonite. So I am able to take any conversation, 20 years of consulting will do this, and I can throw back 3 bullet points. I can take 2 different pieces and almost ChatGPT-like speed, say, here's the connection between the two. The downside to that is sometimes I can be wrong, and I will jump to an answer that's an incorrect answer. So the thing I work on increasingly is to recognize it's a hypothesis and say, all right, I see this. What are the alternative explanations? And what are the different things that might be possible? And how do I know that that's true versus an assumption and all that?
That's great. And more philosophically, what impact are you looking to have on the world around you?
Well, ultimately, I think that there's a body of work that starts with Clay's work, connects into the system psychodynamics field, and has a bunch of other people in it that really can materially improve people's ability to thrive through the uncertainty that we face today. And that can be lots of different people. It can be people who are business executives. It can be parents of children and so on. I think that material is generally not widely distributed. It's generally not well understood. So what I really am aspiring to do is to synthesize, simplify, and spread that material so more people can navigate disruptive change.
And you do that really, really well. And then the last question, when you're having your absolutely best day, you're smashing it out of the park, you're doing brilliant work, what helps you the most to do that?
It's just being able to see lots of different things. It's getting back to what we talked about deliberately wandering. My best days are when I'm writing, and then I'm working on a presentation, then I'm having a discussion like this, and then I might be teaching, and then might be doing something with my kids. And there's somehow magically something that runs through all of it. And the insight comes not where I expect it to come, but it comes when I'm playing catch with my 7-year-old. I'm like, I see it. I see in what he did right here, a connection between just this different stimuli that I've had from the day. And that's when I feel really at the top of my game.
I've loved this conversation. You clearly are just a wonderful, wonderful human being, refreshingly sharp, humble, aware of your own weaknesses, but you know where you're good at too, and you're doing important, impactful work. And I take my hat off to you, Scott. Where can people find out more about your work if they haven't found you already?
So LinkedIn is the social media platform of choice. So, Scott Anthony Tuck, since there are a bunch of Scott Anthonys out there, but if you put Tuck, which is the name of the business school at which I teach, that is the easiest way to find me. Also, if you go to the Tuck website, they have nice pages for all their professors. So those are the places you can find me.
Brilliant. What a great conversation. So that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in this series. Sign up to the YouTube channel, to the podcast, give us a nice rating. And Scott, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you, David.